Hi, this is Misha, and today's video is on the British P-14 in the American 1917 Enfield. The P-14 has an interesting story. It's another result, much like the Ross rifle, of the Boer War. Again, the British soldiers, the Commonwealth soldiers, were being outranged and out-accurized, so many in the British military just didn't have a lot of faith in the Enfield. Even though the SMLE was adopted in 1903 with the Mark III in 1907, in 1910 there was a request by the British government, at least some in it, to develop a Mauser pattern action for use by the British. So that's where this came from. In 1911 the specs went out and the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield developed what was called the Pattern 13. 1,000 rifles were made as trials, and what the Pattern 13 did, it fired a new round, the .276, which was a magnum load, not unlike a 7mm again, or 7mm Magnum I should say, or even 280 Ross. So the Pattern 13 was meant to fire a new magnum round. It used a Mauser action modified to be cock-on close, and it had a few traditional Enfield features. Well, these went into trials, well not this one, but the Pattern 13, and they had some issues. Excessive recoil, excessive muzzle flash, heightened bore erosion, and just, problems to do with magnum rounds. These could have been straightened out, I'm sure, but World War I began. So quickly in 1914, they reworked the Pattern 13 into the Pattern 1914 to fire the standard .303 rimmed British round, which is what this is here. Well, initially Vickers of England was going to produce them because all the other factories were busy making Enfields and other weapons of war. But Vickers couldn't get their act together in time, so what Britain did is they contracted with two American companies, Winchester and Remington, to build these. This is a Remington example. And also Remington set up a subsidiary factory at Eddystone to produce more rifles. So they actually thought about having the Enfield produced in the USA, the SMLE Enfield I should say, but the American companies didn't want to do it, weren't really familiar with that action. They were more comfortable doing a Mauser, so that's why the P-14 was produced in the USA as opposed to the SMLE. It took quite a long time to get the production line up and running, 1915, and it really wasn't until 1916 that the first rifles started to ship to Britain. Well, starting at the muzzle, we have protected front sight. We've got a medium weight 26-inch barrel, pretty typical bayonet lug, stacking swivel, sling swivel. Full-length handguard here. We have an internal 5-shot Mauser-style magazine. So they've gone away from the Lee pattern on this. Last round holdback on the follower. Mauser-style bolt with a dogleg cocking handle, which actually puts it in a really nice place. A ribbed Enfield-style trigger, also a very nice trigger pull. We have rear sights mounted to the back of the receiver, which we'll see later on the trials rifles of the SMLE and then the number 4. So that's definitely something that was carried over from these. Give a much nicer sight picture. Originally, these were made with volley sights, much like the SMLEs of the day for long-range volley fire. Not that they were that useful, but they were there. And then it has an Enfield style safety, but it's on the right side as opposed to left. Not a big deal, but same kind of toggle safety. Enfield shaped stock with the skinny neck here, and then a trapdoor in the butt plate. Well, 1916. Winchester, Remington, Eddystone are all producing these for the British. The problem is they didn't cooperate, they didn't have a real standard spec, so parts from one manufacturer would not work necessarily in a different rifle. So the British had to adopt a P-14W, P-14R, and P-14E, respectively, just to keep things straight. These were called the P-14 Mark I, but in December of 1916, the Mark I Star was introduced, which was really the only modification of this pattern. And what the Mark I Star did, it had a longer lug and a longer extractor for just improvements. Winchester was the last to adopt these. Well, anyway, it took a while for these to get into action, but by 1917, over 200,000 had been sent to Britain, and ultimately, over 1,200,000 would go to Britain. The problem is, by the time these finally got to Europe, they were no longer needed. By 1916, confidence in the SMLE was much higher than it had been prior to the war. Turns out it was actually a great World War I gun, relatively short and light, high magazine capacity, and reliable in the dirt and the grime. Whereas the P-14, much like the Ross rifle, was kind of built to Boer War standards for long range and accuracy, and because of that, it's a heavier, not as heavy as the Ross Mark III, but a heavier rifle nonetheless. Of course, they did have better sights, so these were actually used by marksmen, and some of them were even fitted with scopes. So most of these, when they did see service, were done as marksman guns. But quite a few were actually sent to second line or training duties, and some never even left their crates. They were just sent over to Europe and sat there. After World War I, they were quickly retired in favor of the SMLE. In 1939, in June, the Whedon repair standard was used on these because World War II had begun, and Britain needed, well, it hadn't begun yet, but it was on the horizon at that point. Britain needed all the weapons they could get, so they went back, they pulled these all out of storage, they refurbished them, replaced any broken parts, they put some in new stocks made by Morris, and they also pulled the volley sights off all of them that went through the Whedon repair standard. In World War II, these were mostly used by the Home Guard and reserves. Quite a few were sent to Britain's allies in Europe as well. That said, the P-14 did have a brief career again on the front lines in northern Africa at the beginning of the war, when Britain just didn't have enough guns. Anything would do. Finally, these were officially declared obsolete in 1947 and sold off as surplus or given away. This one here is a pretty nice example made by Remington. As you saw, it still has the volley sights, it still has the blued finish. So either it was sent over there and probably never used, or more likely it might have probably never left the United States. It was produced and then just got stuck here. It is in 303 though. It doesn't have the unit disc in the stock either, it just has a plug. So I'm not exactly sure. The gentleman I got this off of, a friend, he had it since the 80s. So it's pretty unmolested for being the P-14. I always thought these were an interesting part of history. Now that rifle isn't known as well as what came from it. This is a much more famous rifle. This is the U.S. model 1917 Enfield. This is chambered for .30-06 rather than .303 and was used extensively by American GIs, American doughboys, in World War I. Well, America was neutral when the original British contract had been signed in 1914, 1915, but when America joined the war in 1917, much like with Britain, it found it did not have nearly enough 1903 Springfield rifles to equip all of its soldiers with. Well, Remington, Winchester, and Eddystone had been producing the P-14 for Britain for a long time, and it was no big deal to just rework it from 303 to 30-06. That's exactly what they did, and they got these into production fast. It was a tested gun at that point. It was a reliable gun, and it gave a lot of soldiers a very damn good rifle, especially considering the alternative would have probably been nothing. Again, it's the exact same cock-on close Mauser action as the P-14. Only a few differences. These did not have volley sights. They had fuller grooves in the stock for gripping, And because of the 30-06 round versus 303, because 30-06 was not rimmed, this has a 6-shot magazine, so not too bad. Other than that, exact same real gun. This one was produced by Eddystone. Over nearly 2,300,000 of these were sent to American soldiers in Europe, and actually they outnumbered the Springfield considerably. Nearly a 6-to-4 or even 6-to-3 ratio. So quite a few more were actually used by Americans in the Springfield 1903. That said, after the war, much like with the British P-14, these were quickly declared obsolete and retired. And that's kind of the standard. Now in World War II, quite a few of them were sent over to Britain. Others were given away to other American allies, but very few of these actually saw American use in World War II. By that point, there was more than enough 1903s, and the M1 Garand and M1 Carbine were coming online. So only a handful of these went into service in World War II with America, and of those, they were mostly sent to second-line troops. So the story of the P-14 in the 1917 is pretty much very good weapon. Some have even called it the most advanced bolt action of World War I because it did combine a lot of the best features of the Mauser and the Enfield, but it was designed to fight yesterday's war, and it took so long to go into production, but by the time it did, it kind of had been eclipsed by other designs. Also, for the Americans, it had the whole not designed here, not made here, well, it was made here, but not designed here, stigma. So Americans wanted to use their own Springfield guns. So these didn't actually see a whole lot of use compared to the other guns, even though they were quite nicely made, quite well made weapons. Yeah, just thought we'd share these. They're kind of nice. If you have any questions, post them below, and I'll do my best to answer them. As always, this is Misha, and thanks for tuning in.